Good afternoon. My name is Gail Kouame. I'm the Assistant Director for Research and Education Services at the Greenblatt Library at Augusta University. On today's tutorial, we're going to be discussing clinical studies as a form of primary research. And this is a nice follow-up to the tutorial that my colleague Kathy Davies gave recently. So our objectives for this session today are to define types of clinical studies, and then we're going to look at some methods for finding clinical studies both in the literature and in clinicaltrials.gov, which may be new to some of you, but I think you'll find that it's an interesting resource. So just as a refresher to get started, we should talk a little bit about what are clinical studies. Ms. Davies' tutorial the last time talked about experimental versus clinical studies or interventional studies. Clinical studies in particular involve human volunteers or participants as opposed to experimental studies which may use animals or chemicals to do basic research. And the point of clinical studies is intended to add to medical knowledge that's already existing. So there are usually two types of clinical studies. The first one are clinical trials, or what Ms. Davies described as interventional studies. And then there are observational studies. And we'll go into some more detail about what each of those are. So clinical trials or interventional studies are studies in which participants receive interventions according to a research plan or what's called a protocol. And these interventions can include things such as drugs or medical devices or a procedure or even something such as a change in participant behavior such as diet with the hoped for outcome of weight loss, for example. So clinical trials may compare a new medical approach to a standard one that's already existing, or compare the approach to a placebo. So for example, in a drug trial, researchers may be exploring a new medication, and participants in the study would be compared with having one take the study drug and one take a pill that looks like the study drug but really has no effect. And oftentimes you'll see interventional studies with no comparator. It's just looking at something new compared to people who aren't getting the intervention. Drug trials are a little bit unique in that they are phased, and they have phases that have been defined by the Federal Drug Administration. So the first phase is called early phase 1. This actually used to be called phase 0, and there was a recent change. So in early phase 1, researchers are exploring how or whether a drug affects the body. There's very limited human exposure, and there's really no goal of seeing whether the drug has therapeutic or diagnostic effect. They're just truly looking at whether or not the body's affected at all. In phase 2, there is a focus on drug safety. The researchers recruit healthy volunteers for these studies. They're looking to see if there are frequent or serious side effects of the drugs and also how the drug is broken down in the body. And these studies involve small numbers of participants. Phase 2 drug trials are looking at whether a drug works in people with a certain condition or disease. So they're looking at the effectiveness as opposed to the healthy volunteers in phase 1. Safety is still evaluated, and they're also looking at any short-term adverse effects. If this phase is successful, the study or the researchers would move on to phase 3 and look at the drug's safety and effectiveness. And then they're looking at different populations and dosages. So it's a mixture potentially of healthy and volunteers and people with a condition or disease. They'll also potentially look at drugs in combination with other drugs to see if there's any drug interaction concerns. And these studies tend to involve more participants. If the drug successfully makes it through this phase, it moves on to phase 4 after the drug has been approved for marketing. They continue to gather additional information about a drug's efficacy, safety, or optimal use. And there are times, and it has occurred, that drugs have been pulled from the market during phase 4 because adverse effects are discovered after the drug goes to market. As compared to the interventional studies, there are observational studies, another form of clinical research. And in these studies, groups of individuals are observed or certain outcomes are measured. And it's an attempt to understand cause and effect relationships. There's no intervention attempted, and there's no made to alter the course of the disease. And commonly encountered forms of these observational studies that you'll find in clinical research are case control studies and cohort studies. So we're going to talk about those in a little more detail. In case control studies, you're looking at patients who have a disease or who have the outcome you want to study of interest. So those are the cases. And you're comparing those patients with people who don't have that disease or looked for outcome. And in case control studies, you're looking back retrospectively to see how often exposure to a risk factor is present in each group. And there's an attempt to determine the relationship between the risk factor and the disease or outcome. These studies are designed to estimate odds or prognosis. So for example, if you are looking at zinc oxide, which is that pasty white substance sometimes you see people put on to avoid sunburn in lifeguards, you would study lifeguards who have had sunburn and ask them if they have used zinc oxide versus some other form of sunscreen. And then you would have them remember which one they used and determine the effect of these things on their skin. That's one simple example. Cohort studies are one or more groups of people or cohorts who are followed over time going forward. So we're looking forward in time as opposed to retrospectively going backwards in time. And you're looking at the disease or outcome over time and doing status checks or status evaluations over time. And you're trying to determine what risk factors are associated with a disease or outcome. So here is a study type flowchart that might help us figure out what kind of studies we're looking at. So the first question to ask yourself is, did the researchers or the investigator assign the intervention or the exposures? If the answer is yes, then it's an experimental study. If the answer is no, then it's an observational study. Then the next questions to ask, if you are looking at the experimental study, is were the study participants randomly allocated to their respective groups? If the answer is yes, it's a randomized controlled trial. If the answer is no, it's a non-randomized controlled trial. On the observational side, you ask, is there a comparison group? If yes, then it's an analytical study. Then going down the chain, you're looking at the direction. So I mentioned going forward in time versus going backward in time. So in the cohort study, you are first looking at the intervention and then the outcome, which is forward in time. In the case control study, you're going retrospectively, looking at the outcome, so patients that already have the condition, like our lifeguards with sunburn, and looking back in time to see what they did to prevent the sunburn and determine which is more effective. And then there are also cross-sectional studies where you're looking at the exposure and the outcome at the same time. So how do we find these types of studies in the literature? Well, in PubMed, we can use search filters, which are on the search results screen after you put in a search term. So in our example here, we're looking at breast cancer, and then you see over on the left-hand side, there's a column with the header article types. The default choices are displayed as clinical trials or review articles, but there's a way to customize that, and if you click on the customized choice, more publication types will appear. So you can see there's all kinds of article types that you can choose from, and you can click on the check boxes next to them. You can see there are randomized controlled trials, there are clinical trials. If you scroll up and down the list, there's observational study is another choice. So you can click on those, and then it will appear on the column to the left with blue check boxes next to them after you've selected them again. You actually have to click twice. So once you're looking at your search results, you should see that the system will tell you that you've activated these filters for randomized controlled trial, observational study, whatever it is that you've selected to customize your search. So this is a drug trial. They're looking at a medication called talazoparib in people with advanced breast cancer, as well as a BRCA mutation. So that's the population they're looking at. They're using the drug as the intervention. I'm guessing they used a comparator group taking a placebo in this study. And here is the abstract for this study. So another way for searching for clinical studies is to use a utility within PubMed called Clinical Queries. There's a link to this through the homepage of PubMed, and I've circled it in red on this slide. And we're particularly interested in the clinical study categories results that we'll see. So in this example, I have searched on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and I click the search button within the PubMed Clinical Query screen. And you will see results in all three of the categories we saw in the previous screen, but I am focusing on the clinical study categories. So in the example you see here, the default is therapy, which are our interventional studies. We can select broad or narrow scope for the search, and in this example I selected broad, which means it's going to be casting a wider net, looking for as many studies as might be relevant as possible. And then you can see here, just even on the first result, that we are looking at a phase 2 and 3, and we now know what that stands for, randomized controlled study, and this is a drug study for ALS. You can also select prognosis or diagnosis or etiology as study types. And again, you have that choice of broad or narrow scope. And then you can see the types of studies that show up here. So the example here, I'm doing a prognosis search and for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And here we see we have a cohort study in the second result, and that's about weight loss. Another resource I want you to be familiar with in looking for clinical studies is clinicaltrials.gov. This is a database of clinical studies conducted around the world, and it's hosted by the National Library of Medicine. It has studies with their results, but it's also a recruitment database for people who may be looking to participate in clinical trials. And what you're looking at here is the homepage of clinicaltrials.gov. It has a simple search interface on the front page, but I prefer to go to the advanced search screen because you can manipulate the results a little bit more. So you can see that we can type in the name of a condition or a disease, and there is a drop down next to study type for interventional or observational. And you can also see that there's ways to limit if they're recruiting or not recruiting, or if the study has already been completed. And you can even search study by eligibility criteria. This would be more for people who are looking to participate to see if they're eligible to participate in a study. And at the bottom of this advanced here, but you can choose other ways to narrow down the search, including drug phases, if you're interested in studies about certain drug trials at different phases. So I have done a search here back to our amyotrophic lateral sclerosis example. And at the top of the screen capture, you can see we found 31 studies. I used the filters of interventional studies with results. Some of the studies that you find in clinical trials have not posted results that are not completed yet. They're still in process or even still recruiting participants, but I narrowed my search to studies with results. Again, these are interventional studies, and you can see in the columns uh, labeled interventions, these are device. The first study is a device study, and the rest are drug studies. And you can even see that the second one is a phase 3 drug study of a drug that hasn't been named yet. It's just MCI 186. It tells you where these studies are taking place, and once you get into these records, you can see who the sponsors are. These are observational studies about amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and these are observational studies with results. And in this case, I only found 3, but they are interesting, and we can get a little deeper into these results as well. So here's the more detailed view, the study results screen for this observational study about amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And you can see up at the top, this study was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. They collaborated with the New York State Department of Health. And if you scroll down on this results screen, you find a lot of information about this study. They ended up only having 27 participants in the study, and they were looking at brain-computer interface methods of communication for veterans that have ALS. So we've got a little bit of a limited study pool to start from. So I hope you've learned something today about the different types of clinical studies. I've mentioned interventional and observational studies, and then some subcategories of each of those. We looked at methods for finding those clinical studies in the literature through PubMed and through clinicaltrials.gov. And I hope that you're feeling a little better about how to find information about these types of studies. Clinical trials is a great resource to know about because some of the studies that are in that database never make it to publication. So it is a way of finding information about a topic beyond just the journal literature databases. And I want to thank you for your attention this afternoon.